Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast.
Welcome to the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. I'm Rhombus Tix, and I'll be reading for you today a short story called City of Monuments. Washington the 23rd sat upon the eagle throne and looked out upon his city. How did one admit that one was in decline when all evidence pointed to the contrary? The army was at the height of its power, the citizenry were content, and the gladiatorial vidscreens showed constant streams of death, lust, and political backstabbing. It was true, things had shrunk a bit over the centuries, but he certainly did not want to think so, looking at the panoply of hundreds before him. Fortunately, unlike his predecessors, he was capable of transcending that. "All hail the Grand Poobah!" The Yaplin snapped his fingers as he entered the room, performing his ceremonial moonwalk. "Ere ye, ark and herald the Great One!" The audience chamber was vast, centered by the eagle throne. It was a large stone 4 or 5 throne, 4 or 5 times bigger than a man. At one time, it had housed the unspoken one's image. The visage of that one had long since been removed from all record halls at the word and commands of Roosevelt the Ninth. They wanted no uncomfortable reminders of disunion or secession. Such things were not tolerated in the empire. The ceremonial vidscreens lined the walls. The Senate was right, currently in its 573rd session, voting Senator Yajin off the moon seat. And the market Congress on the left, guns were up, taxes were down. Members of both were currently throwing pies in each other's faces, trying to vie for the youth demographic. The room shuffled before him, filled to the brim with the best intellectuals the empire could offer. Unfortunately, that wasn't much. Kennedy the 12th, his predecessor thrice removed, had executed any dissident thinkers from the empire's universities. He had been trained from birth to accept this glory as it was, yet he knew that he had to do better. He would be the great reformer, the one to reverse the tide. "We all think you rock, Washington the 23rd. Long may your rule be awesome and radical. You're just swell," the scholars forming the brain trust chanted their ritual greeting. It had taken Clinton the second decades to convince them that they would not be atomized for voicing an opinion that actually meant something. And after that, it had taken Dole the fifth yet another handful of decades to determine who among them actually had intelligence. The problem was that this intelligence was measured in terms of their ability to agree with his opinion. The American Empire had ceased to be a democracy under the reign of Washington III. Underground historians wrote on the tube wall with cynicism the irony of a nation that had achieved freedom under the tyrannical rule of one king of the same numeric disposition, only to lose it under exactly another of the same name. The ruling dynasty had picked up on this fact and thus changed the name of the imperial designation from first to last. "We are gathered here to save the empire," Washington the 23rd said to them, waving his hand magnanimously. "The Senate and the market have spoken, and I have through the 3 most popular solutions to the problem here in this tiny box. I have the mystery solution, randomly chosen from among the viewing public. Will it be Bill number 1, Bill number 2, Bill number 3, or what I have in this box?" There were numerous shouts from the brain trust. "Pick number 1! No, pick number 2! As was expected, a brawl broke out. Guns were forbidden in the presence of the emperor. Knives were far more effective. This went on for about 10 minutes before the lone remaining scholar smirked while he applied his left hand to his eye to keep it in its socket. It could not be as entertaining as the randomly scripted dramas. They had no business participating in reality government. "I think you should choose a mystery box." There was a collective gasp from the sound effects department, followed by thunderous applause. Washington the 23rd smiled. It had cost a significant portion of the treasury to bribe the University of 23rd and Maine to give the man a diploma, but he was worth it. He was a trained commando in every sense of the word. It was one thing to attempt to be a man of the people, but quite another to actually trust them. Some things were not left to chance, certainly not to the genetic descendants of people who had given away the right to vote. The system was stable, and had worked for over 100 years. Various national tribes chose the Senate, the survivors of which were then able to choose which bills made it to the Market Congress. The recent reforms even allowed for the resurrection after the death of a candidate. In many respects, these were very enlightened times. The Market Congress was composed of various competing interest coalitions that bid to determine which bill would make it to the emperor's desk. All of this was utterly meaningless, since the emperor was the one who determined exactly what the resulting bill meant and how to interpret it. The Yaplin threw his hands in the air. "Let us all praise Almighty Dolgus!" Everyone in the room, all three of them, turned to a large dollar on a cross and raised their hands in the air at the Yaplin's direction. "It is the will of the people! Let us open the holy box!" Washington the 23rd carefully moved his hands around the box. Ancient records indicated that there was a tune called "Pop Goes the Weasel," though none living knew what its significance might have once had. Over and over he cranked. The three men held their breath in anticipation, as eager as ever to answer what it would produce. This was it. The box was not chosen very often. The people that made it to the Senate and the Market Congress were professionals, albeit short-lived ones. They that burned brightest also burned shortest. But at least they left the banalities of plebedom to those who could ill afford true taste and Art Deco decorum. There was a thick metal tango of sound that echoed off the walls. The box came open and spilled forth its contents to the emperor's waiting hand, and it said, "Destroy the City of Monuments!" Brilliant. Washington the 23rd stood and cheered. Bravissimo! The Congress and Senate returned the same chorus. The Brain Trustee and the Yaplin did the same. None of them but the emperor knew what they were cheering for, but they didn't care. They were merely happy to be socially viable and alive. This would not last long. Guns had gained a majority, and thus it was open season on politicians. The City of Monuments had begun long before Washington the 23rd's time. However, people had long since forgotten what most of it was for. It had started out well enough. Initially, there had only been one or two, added a decade, but as the age of the nation increased, so too did the number of monuments. The old Senate building had been eliminated once people had sold their votes. He still shuddered it with anger at the thought of it. The blood of patriots had paid for their freedom, and their descendants had given it away for a free car and a year's supply of pizza. Van Buren IV had mocked the city by putting over 452 monuments during his brief 453-day reign. It did not matter how great the battle was when it sat next to the monument of gratuitous sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Indeed, the perpetually blazing electric robotic marble guitar made any sort of silent contemplation impossible. And yet the people had always held a certain reverence for it, despite all the crassness in their lives. They were glad it was there, in the sort of way that one was glad to have a relative that they never spoke to or dealt with until they were reincarnated or recycled. And there had always been a particularly annoying monument, the one people asked the most questions about. That was the real reason he wanted to destroy the city. He wanted people to look forward. The time had come for conquest, not to revel in the dust of ages. An empire on the rise was an empire that had a long time to live. A letter of the alphabet would not give him pause, V or no V. And when it came to names on the wall, and when the names on the wall were no longer present, they could no longer offer silent protest at his actions. He pushed a button on the throne room chair, and the Imperial laser satellite cut the city into tiny bits in a matter of moments. Wars were a lot less interesting than they had once been. The Yaplin cheered. The Brain Trustee said, "Now it is done! The will of the people! Yay!" Washington the 23rd took no pleasure from this. What was done was done. The time had come to expand the empire and take back what was once lost. With the corrupt half now gone and torn away, the American empire would take back, state by state, what was rightfully theirs to rule. Starting small, perhaps, with Rhode Island. They were ready. The time was now right. The rest of the world might have a problem with it, but God was on his side. He took out the ceremonial marching hat and put it on the Brain Trustee. "You have been drafted, son. Welcome to the army. As Commander-in-Chief, I am officially promoting you to General of all the armies. An army of one, be all that you can be. This time it would work. By cleansing themselves of the dirt and dust of the past, they would be able to achieve what none had in so long, reverse the decline of the Empire. Marching his legionnaire boldly through the radioactive molten layers of the city, he threw open the force field and shouted, "Go get him, son!" He watched his legionnaire march into the wasteland. Slowly but surely the minutes and hours passed as he moved beyond the visual scope of the remaining satellite. Scene. Ernest was a simple fellow. He did as he was told. When the Emperor told him to join the army, he did. When the Emperor told him to go out and fight against the rest of the world, he did. He didn't exactly know how he was going to accomplish this, but he had faith that he would. He watched a lot of on the vid screen about wars. The good guys never died, and the bad guys died in droves. The thing he hadn't understood was the fact that the gun really didn't even work. He looked it up in a book, and apparently it needed, quote, ammunition, end quote. He was quite surprised by the fact that no one had tried to kill him as he left. There was a lot of green at first, miles and miles of it, until he eventually came to a shimmering blue curtain. He touched it with the butt of his rifle, trying to figure out exactly what it was, but it was almost like water. It sparkled around him and his rifle. Finally, he shrugged and stepped into it. He was a soldier. That was what he was supposed to do. The last thing he expected was a cheering crowd. They held up huge signs that said, "Mission accomplished" and "Welcome home, son." It was all quite confusing to him. They were all slapping him on the back and offering him beer, and several rather pretty girls kissed him. Finally, he could stand it no more and asked one of the others, "What are you all so happy about? I'm here to invade you all." They laughed uproariously and hugged him. "Son," one of the older men said, wearing the same kind of uniform, "we've been locked outside our own capital for the last 200 years. Do you really think we would let our democracy go that easily? No. The Imperials locked themselves in some kind of fort screen, and we haven't been able to get them out. Every time they send one of you guys out, it's a cause for celebration. A celebration about the preservation of the Union and the poor lost soul that has found his way home. Someone that has found his way to the truth." Ernest didn't care much for philosophy, but the girls were a lot prettier here, and it would be nice to actually be able to sleep this morning instead of saying the Pledge of Allegiance to Dolges and the Emperor at the crack of dawn. He was happy for the most part. Scene. Washington the 23rd kept waiting. He waited several months for the army of one to report back, but he never did. Time to start training another army. He'd get it right eventually. He was sure of it. Sooner or later, they would take the country back. One state at a time. One state at a time. So, of the 3 stories that I've done in Swamp Castle so far, the older ones, I think this one's the strongest. Gerber and his would-be superhero-ness is a neat idea. There's very little original about this idea. It's political satire and very cynical and sarcastic, but it gives some hope and has just the right amount of sci-fi to keep it interesting. But I can see why it was never picked up for sale. There's, the writing is somewhat solid. It actually does have recognizable characters with a recognizable arc. There's nothing wrong with this story. I'd give this story a solid B, maybe a B-. But there's nothing inherently that makes it stand out that's going to get it to break out of a slush pile either. There's some description. Like I said, it's solid. I enjoyed it, but there's, it doesn't really stand out either. If I was to write this story again, I think I'd make it a little bit less complicated, focus a little bit less on the mythology that I clearly had going here. A little bit less buying into the cutesy, but still, I will admit, over time, clever names like, Washington the 23rd, and focus more on Ernest and tell more of a back and forth between Washington and Ernest's perspective. Granted, that would have reduced the shock value at what Ernest experienced when he went through the curtain, but the thing is that, Sixth Sense is a great movie. Right? But you can only have something like that happen once and have it be as significant. And M. Night Shyamalan only took about 20 years before he realizes that the twist ending is not really something you can build a career on. No other director that I'm aware of has tried to have an entire career on twist endings. And it gets old after a while, right? So the point is that shock endings in stories can be good, but unless they're really, really, really good, like The Star, and if you haven't read The Star by Arthur C. Clarke, I highly recommend it. It's not going to stand out, right? What's the point? Sometimes twist endings are fun, but, unless you're the one person that does the epic Rickroll, try and find something more interesting. Write about an interesting character or an interesting place.
This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. Buy my book, Have Name Will Travel, at Amazon and other markets. RedAnvilCreative.com contains all our podcasts. Copyright
2022!
To fight the forces of evil!